Hi, happy Friday. Welcome or welcome back. It is time to talk about a book. And since it's still October, let's stick with like a spookier book. And so for today, we're going to do White Smoke by Tiffany D. Jackson because I read it and I want to talk about it as usual. So Jackson is already a huge name in YA, and this is her first kind of horror novel. So there is a lot to dig into with this. She is a masterful storyteller, so there are layers upon layers in this. But it follows our protagonist, Marigold, as her and her family move from California to a Midwestern town called Cedarville. Her mother has just won a residency in this community where they are kind of attempting to revitalize a particular neighborhood. And the family itself is kind of running from some things because Marigold has some things in her past that have deeply affected both her and the family. So her mother, her stepfather, brother, and stepsister are moving to this town. And in many ways, they're already kind of running from some ghosts. Or at least Marigold is. And there's some tension in the family because of that, especially with the younger stepsister, Piper. And that is played on throughout the novel. So they get to this city and things aren't quite right. They move into this house, and Mary is immediately starting like looking for bed bugs. She is terrified of bed bugs, and those intrusive thoughts are woven into the narrative. And from the outset, that kind of sets the tone of like looking into this new house and something being kind of off, especially because they get there and the woman that greets them is like, and the basement is off limits. Keep in mind, this is a house that they're being told, due to this residency, if they stay in, after a certain point, they can own. So it is a house that has been gifted to them by this residency that they are living in. They hope to potentially own someday, and they are not allowed in the basement at all. So that's weird. And then the construction crew is like very hesitant to be in this house. There's just already an unease that it sets from the get. And then things start getting really weird. The younger sister, Piper, starts talking about an imaginary friend, and she's 10. So I had initially read her a little younger, then we read that she's 10, and that's like, okay, what's going on there? Mary's mother's fine, like, wedding china. There's a cup that gets left in the kitchen overnight and no one will own up to having been downstairs. There are doors that will just start opening. We start seeing shadows. Mary thinks she sees someone in the shower. It gets creepy quick. And then she finds out through some of the people she's made friends with in this town that there are rumors that this house is haunted. And that is why the community is staying away. And the community itself, there are some dynamics that we get a sense of being bigger things at play than this family is really aware of. And so the personal and the societal are really melded together here, especially because we learn, particularly in the community that Mary's family moves into, it has been really decimated by mass incarceration because of the war on drugs. And these prisons are introduced on the outskirts of the community immediately and kind of loom over this community. And growing up in the Midwest, there are communities that I'm like, yes. So like I said, there is a lot going on here, and I think it is all handled really, really well and gets at some really larger conversations and ideas within the framing device of a ghost story, and in some ways looks at some more modern ghosts in a way that, if you've read Colin Dickey's Ghostland, often gets left out of the conversation in terms of how we talk about ghosts and romanticize ghosts in a way in this country. So really, really liked what it was doing. May talk some more about the thematic and like overarching stuff later. But in terms of like the characterization here, I think Mary is a great narrator to lead us through this story. I don't want to spoil, but it's also kind of the given circumstance. So Mary had had an overdose the year before. She had gotten hooked on pills after a track injury, and those were kind of used to assuage her anxiety over both her parents' divorce and an incident of bed bugs that had happened. Like, she had bed bugs, and that's what kind of sparks a lot of the anxiety around the bed bugs. And so that anxiety is really tangible. And so we're seeing her kind of coming out of this, and in many ways, her family doesn't really trust her. and yet they still love her. We can still feel that care, but she's having to earn back that trust. And so there is that tension there. And as I talked about before with horror, especially last week with the death of Jane Lawrence, there's that sense of where is the line of what we can trust from our narrator, and are they telling us the truth? We are seeing this from Mary's point of view, so there is the really real possibility that she could be keeping things from us. And a lot of the characters in this novel call her out on her behavior at certain points. We are in many ways seeing her fight her demons internally and externally in this narrative, and seeing her overcome both. So she does have a lot of growth in this novel, and there is a journey. So it's really interesting to see her as a main character. I think she's really dynamic and interesting. We also see how these relationships in her life, particularly with her stepfather and stepsister, have been impacted by this because they've known her the least amount of time. They kind of came into her life at the worst moment of her life. And so we are seeing Piper in reaction to this in a lot of ways, but because we're seeing it through Mary's point of view, we're seeing Mary's frustration with Piper and the way Piper is behaving with Mary. And it's really interesting because even as I know that Jackson is kind of setting this up, like I know that I shouldn't be really hating a 10-year-old girl, and yet the narrative makes me kind of hate a 10-year-old girl. And I know that that's what it's supposed to be doing. And I know that that is going to be complicated later, but I honestly think it takes a lot of skill to do that, right? You know you're being played in the moment, but you can't help the emotions that you're feeling. And I think that Jackson does this really well. She knows exactly where to lead me as a reader, what to show me, to kind of get me to think what she wants me to think, and then to be able to turn the tables and complicate all of those things, which I think is one of the more fun things about this novel. Like, yes, on its face, it's a spooky, scary time. And there were scares in this for me. I think it was a little bit more insidious, but it was that what you couldn't see in this. Jane Lawrence had a lot more physical manifestations, but this, it was about what we didn't see, didn't know. Everything was really actually kind of subtle in ways, but also just unnerving enough. Like at certain points, they would get this smell that would just come into the house, and they couldn't explain this rotting dead smell, or the cup that's left out, or just being able to hear things. So it's just these little moments that are like, ugh. So then you're always kind of like wondering what's around the corner, and that unknown is almost scarier than if we had seen more. And because it's so subtle and yet creepy, we are then seeing the people in Mary's life, particularly the adults, question her, especially in relation to her past. So this thing that would already kind of put someone on edge and say, you're making this up, you're imagining it, it's all in your head, is further complicated by that history. And so that is all really interesting and helps heighten the danger, I think, right? Because we've got these complicated personal dynamics that in and of themselves are really tense and somewhat dangerous in terms of like how the interpersonal fallout could go. And then we have the really real feeling present danger of something going on with this house, this feeling that this house, even this community, doesn't want these people here, and what that looks like and how it could impact them beyond, just a glass on the counter at night. And like I said, the community itself has some menace to it as well. We've got these prisons looming. We know that a lot of the community is incarcerated, and it all stems back to the war on drugs that's established within the action. And then also there is this televangelist that comes on the TV every day at a certain time and gives the community sermon. And it is all prosperity gospel based, like the very textbook prosperity gospel, not some of the more insidious ways the prosperity gospel has developed to now, but like plant these seeds, give me a donation, they will grow, you will see prosperity type of prosperity gospel. And so these sermons kind of intersperse the novel too and really set this ominous tone. And this is woven into the narrative. It is there for a reason, but I almost would have liked to see it developed more because I don't think it was fleshed out as much as it could have been. And I think that it was a really nice touch because I think that that is part of the way it is articulating how horror may look in the Midwest at this time, because it is a very modernized version of horror. It's looking at our current realities and anxieties and making those the kind of center. So I'm talking like deindustrialization in the particular way that has hit Midwestern communities. And then with Mary's family moving in, then we've got questions of potential gentrification and the way this foundation is playing with that and how we envision communities looking in the future. There is, as I said, the war on drugs and mass incarceration. We've got corporate greed. We've got the prosperity gospel aspect. We've got the kind of complicated dynamics and corruption of small towns. It's not a small town, but it's not a city. So there's that. And Mary and her family have moved from California to this Midwestern city. So they're outsiders in a lot of ways. And I think the kind of menace of the idea of outsiders and the way communities and these kinds of communities talk or don't talk about the sins of their past and the way those can fester, I think is also really at the heart of this. So change is kind of the thematic glue of this, and what change is and can be, whether it's bad or good or somewhere in between, what that can look like. And the idea of growth is also really intrinsically tied into the narrative, both the more menacing and malevolent side of that with the televangelist stuff. But Mary shows up with a terranium and this idea that she used to be a gardener, and she's kind of rediscovering that in some ways that aren't as great potentially. And one of the relationships she really develops in this town is with a young man, Yusef, who is a gardener, and he's really passionate about it and actually kind of helps with the library, has a club, a gardening club that he's involved with as well, and that Mary ends up getting involved with for at first less than altruistic reasons, and then that is all part of her character development. And so we see the different ways growth and change are really seated, pun-ish, throughout the novel in different ways. So we're looking at all of it from different perspectives throughout. But because we're so focused on this house and the creepy things that are going on there, a lot of those themes kind of like peek out later, and you're like, oh, right, those are really present. In the same way that I got to the end of the book and was like flipping through the pages, like, surely that's not the end. Surely that's not the end. But it is indeed the end. And without spoiling anything, I will say that because this book is looking at kind of more modern ghosts and the ghosts that kind of exist in these deindustrialized communities and our modern era, it is more complicated, and safety, the idea of safety, is more complicated than escaping the haunted house. So take that as you will. I was definitely frustrated. It ended where it did, but it was also so smartly done. I was like, dang, yeah, I get it. That makes sense. I understand. So the ending hit, I think, where it needed to. I will say the preface, I'm not sure how I felt about the preface. I wasn't completely sure how I felt about it when I was reading it at the beginning, and I'm not sure that where the end got us illuminated it for me in a way that made me go back to it with different eyes. Like, I didn't go back to the preface and go, oh, okay, you know, like I get it kind of, but I think that the way the narrative, like the climax, kind of resolved things or revealed things or complicated things already got at the ideas that we needed to get at. And I think the malevolence and the tension are already kind of established in the novel enough that the preface doesn't establish anything for me as a reader as much as it kind of takes away, because I think reading the preface, I'm going in expecting one thing, but I don't know that it's the thing that the narrative itself sets up for me to kind of expect and then to complicate that. So it's just putting different expectations on things and not necessarily seeing it pay off or play off of each other in ways that it needed to or make sense. It's not the worst thing, but everything else in the narrative I think is so tightly drawn that it did pull me a little bit. I can go back and say, oh, this one piece though, I'm not sure about that. So that's the book, pretty much. Trying not to spoil anything. I think it's really smart. I think it's spooky. I think it has great character development and relationships established. It's getting us as readers to really question our own judgment on a lot of things. There is a lot of really skillful maneuvering of reader expectations and then reversal to complicate how we're thinking about something. And even as I can see the maneuvering happening, I'm still falling for the traps, right? I'm like, I know I'm being played right now, but there's really nowhere else for me to go. Like, I've got in the back of my mind that maybe I should be a little bit more understanding with this little girl, but right now I'm a little angry at this little girl. And then later the narrative is like, but wait a minute, why are you so angry at this little girl? And I'm like, I know, but, and it was engaging with some really big questions and conversations in a way that wasn't didactic at all. It was extremely personal and immediate and present, and I loved what it was doing. Anyway, I will say one thing. This is a little detail and has nothing to do with much of anything, but I am curious. In this book, it talks about pop because we're Midwestern, but it basically only mentions ginger ale when it says pop. Like, they'll be like, do you want a pop? And then they get a ginger ale, and they specifically say that it's a ginger ale. In my Midwestern mind, ginger ale has always existed separately of pop. And now I'm having a little bit of a crisis. Is ginger ale pop? If you are Midwestern and you drink pop, you call it pop, would you reference a pop and mean a ginger ale? I had a very line in the sand distinction between pop and ginger ale. Like, if you're asking for a pop, it's one thing. If I wanted a ginger ale, I would ask for a ginger ale. I don't know. That could just be me, but I'm interested now. So let me know. I also don't really drink ginger ale, so that may be part of it, but you tell me. So if you've read this, I'd be really interested to hear your thoughts as well, but for now, I will personally stop babbling at you. Thanks for hanging out. If you feel like it, like and subscribe. If not, no worries. Have a good one, read something good, and yeah,